Thank you, Chair Leyland. I'm here for a budget request. We're thinking of a
You can basically make it out of a wafer or something.
Good morning. I'd like to call Finance, Ways and Means Committee to order for March 8th, 2023. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Representatives Barrett, Boyd, Campbell, Camper, Cochran, Crawford, Faison, Freeman, Gant, Garrett, Hawk, Hicks, Kiesling, Lamberth, Love, Lynn, McKenzie, Miller, Moon, Parkinson, Shaw, Sparks, Whitson, Williams, Zachary, Vice Chairman Baum, Chair Lady Hazelwood.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. This is a wonderful day for this committee because we will complete budget hearings this morning. So thank you in advance for your perseverance, and because we still have important hearings to go through. So can't get too excited yet, but we're on the downhill slope for sure. So Commissioner Swin, if you would like to come to the up front and with your team. I know there's a lot of interest in all things education, and we are looking forward to hearing from you about your budget and plans for 23-24. Chairman Crawford, I'm so sorry I forgot to do personal announcements.
That's okay. I just wanted to take just a second. I have a great young man with me today. He is from the homeschoolers, and he's going to be my shadow today. And he's right back here. If y'all would, please make Ethan feel welcome.
Well, Ethan, we're very glad to have you, and you're setting a high standard for these members in your dress code. So we applaud you for that as well. I mean, that is a fine-looking young man. Chairman Hawk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we're doing personal orders, my dear sweet mother likes to look in on our budget hearings so she knows what the budget is for the state. But she turns, she's having a birthday today. I'm not going to tell folks how old she is because she would still put me over her knee. But happy birthday, Mom, if you're watching. Thank you.
Chairman Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair, lady. Guys, I'd like to introduce a young man who's shadowing me today with the Eagle Forum. It's Mr. Bryant Hirschler. He's from Murfreesboro. If you'll make him feel welcome.
Another well-dressed professional young man. We welcome you to these proceedings. Any other personal orders or announcements? Seeing none, we are out of session, and we are going to begin our budget hearings again. Commissioner Swin, welcome one more time. And we just look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. I will introduce myself and the team and then start. Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education.
Sam Piercy, Deputy Commissioner.
Shannon Gordon, Chief Operating Officer.
Mary Ann Dursky, Chief Financial Officer.
Wonderful. So we are going to get going so that we can leave plenty of time for questions and go through some of the bigger points of the proposed budget. So first and foremost, you have TISA. It's a $350 million increase. As a reminder, $750 million was put into the budget last year. It was used for one-time expenses, but that goes into the formula for this year, adding an additional $350 in the proposed budget to get TISA to a $1.1 billion figure. Next is the summer learning extension that is accompanied by proposed legislation that would have rising kinder through rising ninth grade. It essentially expands into the kinder and ninth grade space while also allowing for the early elementary grades to continue to receive summer programming. The summer bus transportation, which is right under that, I just want to highlight, it's incredibly important, especially for our rural communities. When we did the bus tours this last summer and the summer before, one of the most important things that we heard from school district personnel as well as families was the transportation. Without that transportation, many families just simply couldn't afford to drive their students to school and back. and then pick them up and go back, especially those families who maybe were earning minimum wage or had some financial difficulties. And so the transportation has been huge for districts. Number 4, school safety grants. This is on top of the $20 per student that is already included in the TISA base. And so this is an additional one-time grant amount of $20 million, again, to support school safety measures within our schools. Number 5 on the pre-K special education. Under the BEP, even though it was a K through 12 funding formula, it did have one line item for pre-K, and that was this $18 million for special education. For TISA, since it is a K through 12 formula, that $18 million is an additional budget request for this year to ensure that our district still receives additional funding for their pre-K students who have disabilities. So this is that $18 million that districts have come to expect. It was going again through the BEP funding formula and now would be separate. Number 6 is AP Access for All. That's a program that we started using federal ESSER dollars during the pandemic. It has we have over 95% of our districts who participate. In short, it allows for any student in the state to be able to take any of 14 AP courses in a virtual environment using Tennessee teachers. It has increased the access for students, especially those in urban and rural communities, to be able to take AP courses. And we're seeing that there are the same or higher pass rates or success rates for those students who are in this program. This $5 million in recurring would allow for that to continue in perpetuity. So we still ensure that our schools, especially those that are small schools or small districts or are hard to staff, remain having access to advanced placement courses. Number 7 is Grow Your Own. That's $5 million plus an additional for one staff member. That $5 million allows us to continue the Grow Your Own program in partnership with the University of Tennessee. This has been incredibly popular, and I think one of the things that has helped to reduce over the next 5 years the number of vacancies and those on permits and waivers in our schools. We have a strong number of districts across the state who are participating, 6 to 8 different ed preps who are participating, and I think we heard President Boyd say a few weeks ago, it's the first time in many years where UT is actually seeing an increase in the number of folks who are entering into their ed prep programs. We're starting to see that same trend across our ed preps, and it's because we are removing the financial burden and barrier to becoming a teacher so that more folks in our state can become a teacher without having to carry the debt associated with earning their licensure. And then the last few are just accelerating literacy and learning core and math networks. We've had a lot of success over the last 3 years using the federal relief dollars to have districts do district-led more peer-to-peer work in developing literacy strategies and math strategies. This will continue to be important, especially as we have so much, I think, really good programming and associated legislation around implementation. And then the same thing, number 9 is really around positions to support tutoring. Obviously, that's going to be and continue to be a significant part of the strategy that our districts are using to kind of continue to accelerate out of the pandemic. But right now, it's a couple people at the department part-time trying to support districts, given that we have 150,000 just in K through 8, not including high school, and we expect more students to participate in high dosage tutoring. We really do need a couple of staff members to help districts with their implementation. The remaining things that you see are really around some positions. The wellness and safety field positions are actually existing roles in the department, but they're grant funded. So essentially, we have those positions. We're not asking for additional FTEs, but we are asking for state funding to be able to continue that work. It has been really important for districts. It covers school safety support, as well as some of the kind of behavioral challenges and school culture climate challenges that our districts are really escalating in terms of need. And so this would be one person in every region to certainly help our districts in terms of their implementation of that work. What did you get it? Sorry, Sam. On the next page, Governor's Civic Seal Initiative, that's the $500,000 that will continue. That's been an investment every year. We have thousands of students who are benefiting from that work. It looks a little different in every district, but it really is an opportunity for students to become more involved in civic engagement and understanding how government works. And then the rest are, I'm happy to answer any questions about them. We've got a Nice Wanger Foundation grant and some EPSO fee waiver assistance, but essentially wanting to continue to invest in programs, in organizations, and in work that's going to ensure that our students are on track to be successful once they graduate and earn the types of degrees, industry certifications, et cetera, that are going to ensure that they make a really good living wage after they leave our K-12 public schools. And then on the last page, just a couple of notes. We have summer bridge camps. That's just a swap, and the reduction of vacant ASD positions and a reduction of vacant relief and recovery positions. So essentially, as part of a more conservative budgeting effort, we did reduce some positions in those two areas, and you can see the position counts there for the ASD, reduction of 100, reduction in the vacant relief and recovery positions of 9, because again, we're moving those over to the core office. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time, and thank you for having us this morning.
Thank you, Commissioner. There's a lot of information here and a lot of programs and initiatives that are have funding sources, and I know that there are questions in a number of these, and I'm going to begin with Chairman Hicks.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Commissioner, good to see you this
Good to see
morning.
you.
And I know I always say this and I always embarrass her, but I want the committee to know that we're sitting among royalty in the education realm as Miss Marianne Dursky is sitting there. And I'm telling you folks, and I don't mean to put her on the spot, but if you have questions regarding data for your district, that is the person. When we get in trouble in our district, we send up the bat signal and Miss Dursky answers and we're okay after that. So, but I do want to say that, and I'm certainly always thankful for her to answer our call. So sorry for that plug, but I always want to do that. Let's talk about the CTE grants that were last year. 500 million was appropriated. Let's talk a little bit about that. There was language in the budget that said that money should be handed out by July 31st, 2022. So I want to know, did that happen? How many schools actually had CTE programs? How many picked up CTE programs because of this funding? And so I really want to talk about that. And I know the answer to this, but I just want to get this on record again. Was there a local match? And then again, I want to know how much funding as of today has been allocated for the CTE programs. And thank you again.
Yes, sir. So this was 100% state funding, so there was no local match requirement. In terms of how the funding operated, we are a reimbursement state. So by July 31st, all of the districts who wanted to participate had submitted what we call intent forms. And so we then give them their allocations to say, this is how much money you will get for your high school, for your middle school, for your mixed model school. That was completed as outlined in the Appropriations Act by the date required. What happens after that, because we are a reimbursement state, is districts have to provide what their spending plans or their planning grants will be for their program. So for example, District A might say, we want to expand our welding program. Here's the application or the plan for how we're going to spend that money. They then get that approved and we say, yep, these are all allowable expenses. They can start then charging against that program and we reimburse. We do not provide funding as a state ever. That's just not how our grant funding works. We don't give the money and then they spend it and we check. They actually have to spend it first and then we reimburse. But every district who wanted to apply, we did give them their appropriations by July 31st.
Chairman Hicks.
I don't want to get too deep into that, but I'm looking at the language here and I say that's not how we've done it, but I mean, it literally says in the bill, it literally says in the language that the money will be dispersed by July 1st, 2022. So if that wasn't the case, then we should have talked about that on the front end, because I know school districts right now are still waiting to get their money. And so we should have fixed that instead of, it says what it says. So when school districts get this and they say, hey, why don't we have our money? Then that becomes a problem for us. So I hope we can fix that moving forward, if that is going to be the case moving on, because school districts, again, they thought they were getting that money.
Can I clarify, please?
Yes, please
I think
do.
that would require legislation. So we are a reimbursement state. We are not able to just give districts money. So we have to, the only thing we can do is we can say, this is how much money you are entitled to. And this is on all of our grants. Districts then spend the money on their end and we reimburse, but we are not allowed to just give them that funding. As districts, we process the applications in real time. So as districts say, this is the plan for how we're going to spend the money, and we say, yep, that's allowable, they're able to start spending the money immediately. And so different districts have chosen to take different amounts of time for planning. We had a bunch who did that in the summer and the fall. Most of our districts decided to wait until the spring because they wanted more time to figure out how they wanted to invest. But certainly, as soon as they submit those plans, they can start submitting for reimbursement. But that, I think, to give the money on the front end, I believe, and I would certainly defer to council, there would have to be a change in us not being a reimbursement state.
Okay. Then all I will say about that, and we'll move on, is let's make sure the language, then we can clean that up a little bit instead. If we're going to put dates in there, because it says what it says is allocated to schools described. I mean, I won't belabor, but it just kind of threw some school districts off, especially
Yes, sir.
those trying to get started.
Yes, sir.
So that
I
really
agree with
point.
you on that.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I have so many questions, but I won't take up the time.
Well, go. And
Well-
I have a follow-up while you're thinking about your next one. I have a follow-up on that. On reimbursement, the process.
Mhm.
If a school district sends, you have an approved plan, they spend the money, they send the invoices in, what is the turnaround time on reimbursement?
Yes, thank you for the question. They submit their request for reimbursement through our electronic grants management program, which we call ePlan. The request is submitted, it is reviewed by the program team for appropriate expenditures. That usually happens within 24 hours. It is then approved by our local finance team, and they should receive their money within 5 to 7 business days. And lately, it has been more like 3 to 5 business days.
And that's remarkable and great news because I know some districts are shoestring operations sometimes. So being able to front a significant amount of money up front might prove to be an impediment. So Chairman Hicks.
Thank you. Another question I have is how many school districts have turned down that funding? And if that funding is turned down, does that go back into the pool so other school districts can draw out of that? I guess that's my question.
Yes, sir. So we'll look up how many school districts. We have a couple of districts that don't necessarily serve those grades, and so counting those out. I do believe every school district has applied for some funding. Some public charter schools did not. And then I think the only thing that I would add in terms of kind of the broader landscape around that is we actually spent more than the $500 million. So we pulled from our state federal funds to be able to ensure that we had some schools that expanded. We had some new schools, new approved public charter schools, et cetera. So we actually did some reduction at the department side to be able to add on top of the $500 million to ensure that we didn't have to come back and ask y'all for anything else. $500 million was plenty, and we're very grateful, but certainly wanted to ensure we could keep that commitment to everybody at the level that was outlined in the Appropriations Act.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you, Chair Lady.
Leader Cochran.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here.
Yes,
So I
sir.
wanted to focus a little bit on the summer learning camps that we approved in the special session of 2021. So talk to us a little bit just about gauging success. So other than the pre and post test given to participating students, how do we gauge the success of those camps?
Absolutely. So there are a few things. There are kind of the quantitative measures, and then I'll talk a little bit about the qualitative measures that are more difficult to really account for. But what we look at is we look at the pre and post assessment. So how did students do going into the summer? That's kind of the results of their TCAPs and pre-assessments that we give. How did they do with the post assessment at the end of summer? We also look at the beginning of the year universal screener. So if they took a universal screener, especially in the younger grades at the end of the prior year, do we see any summer slide, or do we see less slide than we would for those students who did not participate? The other thing that we look at is we look at spring to spring. So students who participated in summer programming, did they do as well or better than their similar peers who did not participate? So that's not going to be a statewide average, but peers who are demographically are representative of those who participated. We are seeing really encouraging numbers on that. I think this spring, we obviously don't have the TCAP data back, and the first year was our first year. But what we've seen from just the actual pre and post test and the universal screener, we're We're seeing less slide over the summer. So more students are staying stable from the spring to the fall. We're also seeing greater engagement and attendance. So more students are keeping that continuity in terms of attending school. And frankly, the thing that you can't measure as much are 2 points. Number one is kind of love and joy of being in schools. It's a very different experience. We've got great programming fall to spring. Summer feels a little different. There's project-based learning. Kids are outside. They're raising butterflies and letting them release into the wild. It's a beautiful thing. Our districts are knocking it out of the park. And the other thing that we're hearing specifically in middle school is a confidence booster. The kids who were in the back of the class and couldn't raise their hand, needed a little bit more time, didn't feel like quote unquote the smartest kids in the room. They're in smaller class sizes in summer, getting more attention at a level that is more accessible for them. And I have heard time and again, and we did 100 visits over the last 2 summers. What I hear the most from middle school students is it's the first time I feel like the smart kid in the class, and I have way more confidence to take risks and engage. I think what we're hearing from teachers is they see that then move into the next school year in terms of student engagement. Hard to measure in a quantitative space, but I think something that has been consistently reiterated across the state.
Okay, thank you. And as far as districts that participate in the camps, do we know the percentage of districts who are participating, and has that increased or decreased?
All of our districts are required to participate, so they do. All of them have essentially provided their own programming or partnered with another public school district, and so they do have the option to use a third-party provider, et cetera. But they've all done their own programming. It all looks very different, but it is exceptional work.
Gotcha. And then do we have an overall student enrollment of those? And then how has that trended? Has it increased or decreased?
So it's decreased a little bit from summer 1 to summer 2. We did expect that because summer 1, we're coming out of that 2020-21 school year. We had a lot of families who were enrolling, just wanting to get back in buildings, get some normalcy back. We had a slight drop this last spring, but generally speaking, we see a higher percentage of enrollment in the lower grades, which makes sense. We see it drop off a little bit in the middle school grades, but overall across the state in the elementary school space, we're still in the kind of 17.5% to 21% range, depending on the district. In the middle school space, we're closer to kind of the 13 to 16% range in terms of overall enrollment and participation. It is one of the highest participation rates in the country. First year, I think we were tied for first, if not just a little bit over. I like being number one on things like that. But this year, I think we maintain to have top 2 enrollments in the country for summer programming statewide.
And then just one final follow-up, Chair Lady. As far as our proficiency in math and reading, how has this affected it? Are we back to pre-pandemic levels? Just talk a little bit about how has our proficiency changed?
Absolutely. So I'll talk about literacy and then ELA and then math. And so for ELA, we did see that significant drop in proficiency, which happened across the country. What we saw last spring in our TCAP numbers is that the majority of our grades had actually gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and a couple of cases actually had outperformed that. There's been some conversation about whether or not that's a quote unquote real number, or did we change the test? The test is actually, we do all of the testing and psychometrics on that test beforehand. So we do what we call field testing to get a good bar. We are also one of the only states that closely matches NAEP. So we also know that the rigor of our assessment stays consistent year to year. So we do trust those numbers. Third grade, we're about 0.5 point to a point lower than we were pre-pandemic. Most of the other grades in ELA are now at where we were or above. Really, really important. One of the only states that showed that kind of progress and growth. In math, we have recovered. We have not recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. Across the board, we're about 40% of the way in terms of closing that learning loss gap. It is outperforming what we are seeing in other states. Not every state has released their data still. We were the first to do that. But I think what we are expecting to see based on some of the benchmarks and interims that our districts are providing in anecdotal conversation is that we will have another really significant jump to close that gap. I don't think we're going to see a full math gap closure until the spring after this one. It's just going to take a little longer because it was a double-digit decline. And again, that's across the country and consistent with what we saw on NAEP.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Representative Lynn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, I just want to say that my family had very personal experience with the summer learning camps, and I do want to let my colleagues know, at least in Wilson County, It was great. It was a great experience, and the kids really learned a lot, and they actually loved it. Didn't want to go at first, but they loved it. And I think that's a great testament to the talent of the teachers. The teachers are just amazing.
Yes, they are.
But let me ask you, I have quite a few questions here. So the department was allocated $67.3 million in fiscal year 20 and 21, and an additional amount of the same in 21-22. And now the 22-23 budget appropriated $25.5 million in recurring federal general fund dollars to the department for these summer camps. Can you provide a breakdown for us of how these funds were actually spent? It's such, it's such a glob of a number. So how were these funds actually spent, and has all the funding which was allocated been spent?
So I'll cover the first half, and then Sam will talk about the percent of funding that has been spent. So the law is it's not prescriptive in terms of how you spend the time, but what you're allowed to spend the funding on. So a lot of the funding, as we see with education budgets, does go to personnel and staffing. So we have the minimum amount that teachers make per week. Many districts supplemented on top of that, plus administration personnel. What I think was also really wonderful is that so many of our districts expanded for CDC classrooms or self-contained classrooms, really ensuring that students had the same level and quality of services as the regular year. Those were also, I think, pretty significant components of funding. The other thing that we saw was really around materials and supplies, because there was so much more project-based learning. A lot of our districts really invested in STEM. An example of a district that I looked at in Lakeland in West Tennessee, that director was talking through some investments they made in technology, robotics, things that they used in the summer. They used that summer funding to invest in those resources, but then continue to use them throughout the year. So you see that benefit extend into the regular school year, which has been really powerful. The last thing that I will say, which was a big part of the budget, because you all were generous and supported transportation, which was huge, was additional nutrition work. We had a lot that was funded with nutrition from federal sources, but districts did have kind of additional snacks. I saw Dr. Cash here earlier. I remember they made s'mores, and they were doing a science experiment to figure out how the sun can bake s'mores. So kind of fun things like that. You saw a lot of that come in. And I do want to give a lot of credit to community partners. A lot of community partners and districts donated, bikes or books or toys to invest students to come in. So there were attendance rewards and things like that. So districts were very creative, but those were the big buckets they were allowed to spend their funding on. And then I'll turn it over to Sam. I do want to say we did allow a little bit more flexibility this year for field trips. In year one, we did not do that. We really kind of kept it to academic supports at the school. What we found is that districts wanted a little bit more flexibility, not necessarily to do a pool day, but to say, we're going to go to the zoo as part of our science lesson and then read about that in literacy and some of those connections. So we did allow for more flexibility this last year.
And yes, ma'am, to the question regarding if there was all the funding spent or not, there is funding still carried over from the prior summers. And in part, I would say that is due to two things. In the first summer, we were able to leverage more TANF dollars than we originally anticipated, because we had higher participation of economically disadvantaged students than we originally thought. And that was a great win. It saved state dollars. That's a good thing. And what we also saw is that districts are still leveraging some of their own federal relief money that was also dropping dead over the past couple of summers. So in those cases, there was kind of a balance in their own internal bookkeeping to make sure that they didn't lose access to federal dollars either.
Oh, okay, that's great. The enabling legislation provided that teachers would receive a stipend of at least $1,000. What is the current stipend received by teachers? And I heard you say that it's often supplemented by local dollars. So do we have an idea of what the stipend is? And is it enough to attract the teachers that are needed?
So the stipend is still $1,000 set as the minimum. Some districts kept it that. It really had to do with their local salary schedule. So I might use Nashville or Davidson County, Williamson County. They're more likely to supplement on top of that just because their salary schedules are higher than you might see in a Lake County or a Perry County. And so we did see some variance across the state. Districts used predominantly their federal relief funding to be able to provide additional compensation for teachers if that made sense for them. And we also saw teachers break the summer apart. So it might be I took 3 weeks, my partner teacher took 3 weeks. And what that allowed is a lot more flexibility to get more teachers in. They got, teachers said, hey, I got to make, $2,000, $3,000 extra this summer. pays for, my family vacation or what it might be, and I don't have to commit the whole summer. So we saw different levels of creativity in terms of how districts approach that. Same thing with bringing in supplemental staff. We saw a lot of school districts have a main teacher, but then bring in teacher candidates from ed prep programs, paraprofessionals. That is a slightly different salary structure. It still allowed for small groups and to maximize the teachers that were there. So again, districts use different creative budgeting to be able to match whatever the capacity they had from a resource perspective. But ultimately, kids had great experiences regardless of what that looked like. So that was neat to see.
Great. I like that flexibility. That's great. So in September of 22, FSAG approved $102 million appropriation in federal COVID relief funding to the department for addressing impacts of lost instructional time. How will the department utilize this funding?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that question. So actually, that is the 25 million you see represented here. So FSAG approved that money to basically replace for the period of 4 years that the state has availability to those federal funds to replace the 25 million that is currently in the budget using state dollars. So we are offsetting that for 4 years to leverage this federal money, but it's still to go to the same camps that are already in current law.
Okay, gotcha. My last question is about the bus transportation. How much funding is allocated annually for the summer bus transportation? So happy you're doing that. A lot of parents are reticent to put their child on a school bus, and I'm just curious how that's going.
So the initial year was $18 million. We did not see that fully spent. And so what you see in this proposed budget is $10 million, which is approximately what we would expect and what has been more consistent with use in the districts. I will say what we see in ridership and different ways that districts have approached transportation really is about trying to mirror the experience of those folks who do use transportation during the regular school year. So especially in our rural communities, a student might live 25, 30 minutes away. They always take the bus, and families just don't have the ability to get their kids to school and back. I will say one, in East Tennessee, a parent example that really stuck with me, the parent made minimum wage. The cost of gas at that time was pretty astronomical. And the parent said, I literally cannot afford to drive my child 40 minutes to school and back twice. That's an hour and a half to 2 hours of my workday every day. So I've essentially cut my income too much. The transportation allows that child to still get access to summer programming. And so that's, I think, probably the most powerful story I heard about just providing equitable access for all of our kids.
Yeah, and you might find this interesting because I did in my district, they're actually doing a study. They've got a consultant doing a study on why families don't use the school bus. And, there's some obvious reasons, but they're also going to figure out, it's probably a lot of it is timing. Some families, the bus literally comes at 6:05 in the morning, and this mother in particular said, I let my children sleep to 6:15. They're not even up at 6:05.
Yeah.
So I drive them to school. And of course, in congested areas like mine, that makes a huge difference in that rush hour traffic, all of that. So they're doing a study. I think we'll learn a lot. I think it's going to be really interesting, and other districts might be interested to see what they conclude, because they may be adjusting timing, which would also allow school bus drivers to serve maybe more than one route in the morning, one route in the morning, one route in the afternoon, but maybe really hire them on to serve each route, and they can be a full-time employee with benefits, which, some of them want and some of them don't care for, but we'll see what happens.
Yep.
So
It
thank
would
you very
certainly help
much.
with shortages. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Transportation is always a huge issue, and the timing. I know in our district there have been some modifications made because all the studies show young children. It's pretty difficult for young kids to get up that early, and then teenagers, they don't actually engage till 9 or 10. So if then.
Living that currently, Madam Chair. So this morning, in fact.
Chairman Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Commissioners, great to see you today and
see
your
you.
team. Appreciate y'all coming. You've answered a few of my questions as you've touched on summer learning and summer camps, but as far as the accelerating literacy and learning, the English and math tutoring networks, In the budget, there's $10 million recurring funds. And so I just had a question. Didn't TISA, didn't the formula cover some of that? Or is that, are we going to need this new funding for that?
Great question. I really appreciate you asking that to clarify. So the new funding formula will allow for school-based support. So for example, providing tutoring at the schools, providing acceleration opportunities through RTI, before and after school programs, et cetera. This $10 million is really focused on teacher professional development, district professional development. We also have a couple of statewide contracts that districts are able to then purchase off of or receive services for free. So for example, in one of our literacy networks, and we have over approximately 100 districts who participate in that, they work in regional cohorts. They do shared site visits. Teachers receive additional professional development credits they then don't have to pay for. They also are able to do a lot of networks in terms of building resources and shared resources that they can use in the school. So this is funding less about the actual service to the students and more about the services to the professionals in the buildings and the districts in order to provide those services. The last thing that I'll say is that we do have contracts for things like online tutoring. For math, we would expect that we will likely move into that space for ELA at some point, just because we have a lot of demand and we do have some limitations in staffing, and some of our districts have significant limitations. And so when the district is able to purchase statewide licenses, it is significantly cheaper for our districts than if each individual district has to purchase the license on their own. And that can mean the difference. It might not sound like a lot, but $4 to $6 per student. We can save that if we buy licenses for every student in the state versus every district having to buy a license for every student in the state. That in itself can be anywhere from $4 to $6 million. So this would cover any of those kind of online tutoring programs should we want to continue if they have great efficacy.
Chairman Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. So I did not realize that it's more for the teachers than it is for the students, but the actual tutoring networks that you were talking about there at the end, is there going to be some overlap there with some of the summer camps or summer learning, or are they two totally separate programs?
A great question. So I think it's kind of like the overlapping Venn diagram where they're separate, but there is that chunk in the middle. And so we have because we have teachers who are there for summer programming, many of our districts actually schedule professional learning opportunities to happen during the summer when teachers are already there. So it's not just more weeks that they have to come back. And so you see things like that during the summer, especially when we were doing a lot of the literacy and early phonics training from the Literacy Success Act legislation. I think the other thing that you see is during the school year with the professional development days that are already built into a lot of our school schedules, what you will see is that teachers are able to participate in professional learning opportunities, look at their data from universal screeners and internal benchmarks, and then also provide additional tutoring opportunities to students. So we've seen some districts split those days or do virtual instruction for part of the day, professional development for part of it. What I think is really important, though, is that the state is saying we are going to fund the services to students to accelerate and grow their achievement quickly. And we are going to invest in the professionals in our school buildings to ensure that they feel empowered and have all the tools and resources they need to then provide those services. So this $10 million is essentially for those educators and the networks that they have to grow professionally. TISA is really about direct to student services.
Chairman Boyd. Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning.
Good morning. Good. How are you?
Great. On your first slide, you were showing 18 million in new recurring monies for pre-K special ed. And it's my understanding that was something that was in place with BEP, but maybe not in TISA. So can you talk about if that's, it says that it's not for positions, but is that going to be used to create some positions? If not, how's that money going to get spent?
Yes, sir. So the BEP was intended to be a K-12 formula. This was kind of I don't want to say random, but it was a misplaced $18 million for pre-K that really should have been outside of the formula, just like everything else in pre-K. With TISA, we left all the funding that was in the BEP, including the 18 million as part of that initial allocation, and now it's at the 1.1 billion. This is 18 million new dollars. What I would expect is that districts are going to spend this funding just like they spent that same funding under the BEP. It is restricted to special education. Some of our districts do use that for staffing. It wouldn't be additional funding, so it wouldn't be used to hire additional staff. It would essentially be to maintain the current services and operations that they have now.
Representative Barrett.
Thank you for that answer. And then on the ESSER grants, it's my understanding, I think most of the ESSER monies has to be spent by 24. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
Can you talk about how are ESSER monies being spent or utilized in all 95 counties? How is that program being utilized?
Yes, sir. So we talk about ESSER 1, 2, and 3. They're different pieces of federal legislation, but that's kind of how we've broken it down. ESSER 1 is now over. So the districts had until this last September to spend the funding, and then we have kind of a liquidation period that happens after. We spent all the money, so that's great. We do not like giving that back to the feds. We'll spend it on our kids. So right now we're in kind of spending down on ESSER 2. That money essentially expires in September of 23. So this September, they'll have the same kind of liquidation period after for us as a state. We have spent the majority of that funding. It looks a little different district to district. Many of our districts have fully spent that funding. We have some districts that have not. What we see is that's usually just them right sizing at the end of the school year. So they aren't going to charge against the ESSER account. They want to see allowable expenses and maximize money that's going to dry up or that's going to expire and then recode. And so what we expect is no concern about spending that ESSER 2. ESSER 3 is that very large chunk. It was about $3.5 billion of the $4.5 billion that we received in federal relief funding, maybe just slightly less than that. That chunk of money, we still have a pretty good amount that's left in districts. Again, because they're focusing on spending down ESSER 2, it's hard to see how much of the ESSER 3 they're going to spend. As a state, we have allocated, or at least a line item every single way we're going to spend that funding. We also have kind of safety net plans so that if we underspend, let's say on tutoring, for example, we have 3 or 4 different things that we will then move that money towards so that we ensure that we don't revert any of those funds. Our districts have done the same thing, and the majority are spending their funding on academic acceleration. Most are 35 to 55% on academics. And then we've got a pretty big chunk that's on facilities, deferred maintenance, and things that are longstanding needs of the district. So we're seeing those as the 2 biggest spending items.
Representative Barrett.
And then on ESSER, we've been alerted recently by the comptroller's office that there've been some directors of schools that are paying themselves out of ESSER funds. Is that something that's authorized by the program itself, or do the directors still need to get local approval to pay themselves out of these funds?
So the department provided, and on a number of cases, what districts will do is they'll provide proposals and say, is this an allowable expense? In a couple of the cases, and we've got a decent handful where districts said we want to work in collaboratives together and we want to provide anyone who participates in those collaboratives with an additional stipend. The department did say that that was an approvable expense under ESSER, so districts are able to charge additional stipends regardless of the position. For folks, I can't comment on individual board policies and what the local process is to get approval for that. But in terms of, is it an allowable expense under ESSER? Yes, it is, to provide stipends to anyone in the district. There aren't restrictions on that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today.
Yes, sir.
Do you have an estimate on the number of children that left school during the pandemic and didn't return once schools reopened?
Sir, I believe overall we saw a drop in our student population of about 10 to 15,000 during the pandemic years, but those numbers and kind of per grade level coming back seems to be bubbling back into the system.
Freeman.
So we're back to pre-pandemic numbers. Are we back to pre-pandemic numbers in every part of the state? Or are there some areas that are affected differently than others?
So it does vary pretty significantly by area of the state. And so what we have seen statewide is we saw the greatest amount of transition out of the public school system in terms of enrollment in the kindergarten and, in 8th grade through high school. That is what we would expect to see, frankly. We also saw that across the country. People just didn't put their kids into kindergarten. They waited a year, or they decided to do homeschooling or something else for their very, very young children. In high school and 8th grade, you saw more students disengage. Frankly, the interface in terms of online learning just didn't work for a lot of high school students. They got jobs, they did other things. What we are seeing in terms of the return, and this is in Tennessee and nationally, is that the elementary school space is largely coming back. We are not seeing that at the same levels for parents who just are deciding to keep their students if they moved into a private school setting, for example. With elementary, a lot of times what we're hearing is we're just going to keep them there for the next 2 years and not do this back and forth. So we did see that, especially in areas that have high concentrations of private schools. So frankly, greater Nashville area, somewhat in Memphis, but not as much as we're seeing kind of in Middle Tennessee. The other thing is that we are seeing a little bit of a drop in those students who we would have expected to continue into high school. So we did have more students who did not return into high school than we might have seen in prior years. But as Sam said, we are largely back to pre-pandemic numbers. The one thing that I do want to highlight in terms of the characteristics of students is that we are seeing a drop in the number of students who qualify as economically disadvantaged. A lot of that is because a number of our families, Tennessee's got a very strong economy, are now making just slightly above what that line is, and that's a federally determined line. So we're seeing some just pop up against that. So our end size or our counts are coming back to where they were pre-pandemic, largely and almost universally, except for a couple of those larger metro areas. But our students, what we are seeing in terms of the demographic counts, have shifted a little bit, specifically in economically disadvantaged and English learners. We are seeing more English learners, fewer economically disadvantaged.
And just
Yes,
to
sir.
follow up on that regarding the numbers, because when we talk about pre-pandemic levels, how do we take into account, or do we take into account the fact that we've had an influx into Tennessee of new residents? So even if we were at pre-pandemic numbers, the percentage of students actually enrolled in public schools might still be lower. So do we have any kind of measurement for that?
Yes, ma'am. So we can't account for anyone who's left Tennessee in terms of where those students are. What we can account for is I have a first grader with this state student ID. Is that first grader showing up somewhere else in one of our public school districts? So that's one of the ways that we're able to measure kind of attrition within the public school system. What we are seeing is, number one, we don't necessarily know kind of homeschool, how many students moved into that kind of space versus private school versus traditional public versus out of state. We are seeing again that largely, and we can get you the exact percentages, the students who were enrolled pre-pandemic have largely come back, except for a couple of our bigger metro areas. We are seeing, though, an increase in certain communities where they are new to Tennessee families. That growth will continue. Where you see the kind of really, I think, significant characteristics there are it's students that have a different demographic profile in certain districts than we've seen before. And that's another way that we can look at kind of new students and be able to project out trends. So ultimately, we are back to pre-pandemic levels. We are seeing an increase in private school enrollment, which helps us understand kind of the total end size count. But we can get you specific numbers in terms of students who had an ID who were here in 2020, who are no longer enrolled in a public school in Tennessee in 2023. That would be the best kind of apples to apples. Again, doesn't account for students who have left the state.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Chairman Williams.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up to Representative Freeman and Chair Lady Hazelwood, all this data as it relates to these empty seats that are now, except for the metro areas that are that are back to pre-pandemic levels, how do you collect that data? Is that something you do internally? What is the process associated with that?
Yep. So we have counts where attendance and enrollment is submitted. We've got actual data that's submitted to the department on a monthly basis. We use that, of course, for the funding formula. And so we're able to look at a lot of the data that way. We also look at state assessments. And so in the spring, we know which students are kind of slotted into which assessments. It's another way for us to see who was here last year and took an assessment versus who was here this year. All of that data does come to the department. We need that for things like our accountability system, our assessment system, various reports that are due to y'all. So we provide a state ID, and then districts also have a local ID. So we use that state ID and birth date as a matching for a student.
Yeah, the reason for the question is because I think this committee and the Tennessee General Assembly in the last budget cycle set aside funding for a program that was led by Chairman Haston that allowed for a third party to help find these kids who we had lost, and particularly in those large metropolitan areas. I think we set aside $3 million for that. I was in contact with your department, your old legislative liaison, about the RFP for that and where it was going. Whatever happened to that process? And I noticed that 2 other states had renewed that policy or that process, and they had found thousands of missing students in their systems, and just wondered, did we decide not to do that, or did we do that, or where are we in that process?
Yes, sir. So we did run a competitive procurement for that process as outlined in the legislation. We were not able to find a vendor who agreed to kind of, frankly, the boilerplate state terms. And so we were not able to move forward on the first procurement. We then ran a second procurement. And just for context for everybody, procurements take about 9 to 12 months in the state when you're doing a competitive procurement. So we're running a second procurement to find a different vendor, worked with some folks here in the General Assembly, realized that we're now 2 to 3 years out. And so the use of those funds and the number of students we might quote unquote still be looking for, the return on investment wasn't there. And so we're given some direction to kind of hold on that process. And so we will get you the numbers in terms of actual kind of attrition within the public school system to give you a sense. But what I will say is our districts using their local funds have done a really good job of looking for students, knowing where their students went. I think because we have a county-based system in particular, and because our superintendents and our principals are very clued in to all of their kids, where they are, trying to get them back, especially with the new funding formula, and certainly wanting to ensure that students are in school. We've been able to recover in a very different way than we're seeing in other states. Again, I do want to say that there was an exception in one of our larger metro areas, as we have seen across the country, but we'll get you those firm numbers in terms of enrollment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's easy to say, that our locals could have done a great job, but, I think the legislature really was very particular about wanting to utilize the service in order to find these children, because time was of the essence.
Yes.
And the communities that we serve needed assistance because of the different things that they were doing. This body and the Senate decided that this was a really important part. I'm disappointed to hear that it took us so long to do that. I was in contact with your department and said, this is something we need to facilitate. And quite frankly, it really wasn't started until I think it was September after we approved the budget earlier that year. And of course, the money didn't come live until July. So I personally am pretty disappointed, because if that $3 million would have found another 5,000 kids, and particularly in across the state, I think it was money well spent. So I understand and appreciate the difficult and hard work that our local LEAs are doing, but I do think that it's important to do that. And I look forward to supporting the chair lady and Chairman Hasten on some other ideas they have in order to try to find these students, because it's very important. We have a fiduciary duty to make sure they're educated in the state, and that's finding them is the most important part. Thank you.
Chairman Hawk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, thank you very much for being here. I want to go down the road of school safety, but first I want to go down the road of TISA and what I'm hearing from school districts. The legislature has made it very clear that we support SROs, that we support school nurses, that we support coordinated school health. And when we go back and have meetings with our school districts, we tell them funding is in there. It's in TISA for all this. How are we going to hold accountable school districts to ensure that they invest monies in areas where we have deemed appropriate, specifically to the SROs, to the school nurses, coordinated school health, and the other initiatives that the General Assembly has put forth?
Yes, sir. So really appreciate that question, because I think it'll be, especially as we've now moved to a student-based funding formula, helpful to clarify this is how you can kind of ensure that funds are spent in a certain way versus district flexibility. So I'll actually use the examples that you provided. With coordinated school health, the funding that's appropriated for coordinated school health, or was appropriated under the BEP, that is in the base, and it's accounted for in the base. The direction of how that money can be spent is seen in a different part of statute, right? So districts are still held accountable to implementing the statute, which says this is the coordinated school health statute, and here's the money in the formula for you to do that. For something like school nurses or SROs, there is not a statutory requirement in terms of you must have an SRO at every school, for example. So that becomes, there is funding for districts to make that choice if that's what they want to do, but there isn't the requirement for them to do so. And so when there's funding appropriated through the TISA formula, districts have quite a bit of flexibility in how they spend those funds, unless it is restricted as in another part of statute. Coordinated school health is a good example. There's also what's clearly articulated around teacher salaries and existing teacher salaries. So that's kind of the pairing that would need to occur.
Thank you. And I'll continue. I see this as
Please
being
continue. The four-string quarterback is now in the game. Thank you.
four-string quarterback. That's
Sad
funny.
49ers reference. Yep.
That's funny. I don't care who you are right there. That's going to come up. That's going to continue to come up.
Yes,
And we are all about, we want locals to be able to make the decisions on these funding mechanisms, but we're already seeing some questions about this. And I want to ensure that as we go down the road of school safety, that our kids are safe and families feel confident that we've got an SRO at the school buildings, as we have said the General Assembly wants that. So I want us to keep a close eye on that, and I know that will come up again.
Yes, sir.
In the vein of school safety, there's $20 million line item that looks to be non-recurring for school safety. How are those funds going to be distributed as on a grant basis? Tell me, are we looking at inside school buildings, a certain amount, a dollar follow the student? How are we doing that? Because I'm noticing anecdotally, I'm seeing some numbers, that we've got a graph that shows the assaults are going up. Possessions of weapons on school grounds is going up. We've got some real issues to deal with there. So tell me about the school grant, school safety grant money and how it's going to be distributed, please.
Yes, sir. So the plan is to do it on a per student basis. So every student in the state is going to get their proportional share, regardless of the school that serves them. And so I hope that will continue the opportunities to make sure that the dollar is with the kid and that the services are there for the kid. In terms of the intent of the grant program, it is largely in alignment with what we've done historically in school safety. So looking at school security assessments, understanding where potential risk areas are, and using money to try to address those. It's also an opportunity for districts to bridge the fact that school safety money that historically has been external to the funding formula is now part of the base. And so there's an opportunity for them to spend this one-time money wisely to kind of understand, I've got this moment to bridge back into using the dollars that are also there, while also giving us a chance to say, we can do more to protect our kids in the schools, and here's an opportunity to leverage that.
Thank you, Chairman Hong. Just as a follow-up to the school safety. So in the budget this year, we have $20 million that he just asked about that was for school grants. How does that coalesce, or how does that compare to $100 million that we're doing? Is $100 million for the new officers, I suppose, is there? And how does that work?
So I think that the funds requested here for safety are intended to really support strategies at the school level. The funding at Homeland is really intended to provide a community approach to providing additional support that doesn't exist consistently across the state. And so the governor identified that we really needed to make sure we were changing the school climate around safety in all facets. And that involved a community approach. And we think one of the best ways to do that is making sure that we have local law enforcement dedicated and available to provide support to districts to help them with not only their safety planning, but emergency response preparedness and other issues that come up along the way.
Do you think that, I guess, when I look at my local LEA and I look at my education system, particularly my high schools and middle schools where we have SROs already in place, in some instances they're counselors, in some instances they're safety officers, but it just seems to me like that we have kind of a community system that works really well. If you're introducing a new third wheel, nobody ever takes the third person to the prom. To me, it just seems like there's an interesting dynamic there. And I wondered how easily it'll be to mold them, fold those together, and particularly when in some cases, maybe most cases, these new law enforcement officers with Homeland Security are going to be not from there, or not a part of, because of their training, are not going to be a part of the community already. does that concern you at all that it'll take them a good deal of time to do that?
So I'll jump in on that. I think one of the things that we've noticed, and certainly I do want to say that we do not have SROs in every school, right? And so that is, I think, something that's wonderful in your district. And I know we've talked about that a little bit. Many of our districts do not have either the resources or haven't been able to do that. So one of the things that we found is that there were and have been a number of threats, either real or called in, so to speak. And some of those were real and legitimate. And so for all of our school districts, by having this additional personnel, it does provide an infrastructure that is consistent across the state. So no matter where you live, whether your district is able to afford an SRO or not, there is law enforcement ready to respond and frankly do some of the tracking of online social media threats that might come in, things that our SROs in schools don't do because they're doing all these other wonderful things. They do a lot of counseling, relationship building with students. It is a different role. This is much more about kind of the tactical operations of if there is a threat, do we know that in advance? Are we then able to act on it before something tragic happens? One of the things that in talking with some of our school districts is this ends up being a partnership. So the school district safety director, coordinator, whoever that role is, who oversees SROs or whatever other law enforcement or supports might be at the school, they are then able to work with Homeland and law enforcement on a structural perspective to say, if there is a threat, if there is a shooter on campus, this is the process. You have the school plans. This is the entry point. They're able to be some audits and checks to make sure the school is a secure building. So some of those routine things that, again, many of our districts just don't have the capacity to do, or counties don't have the capacity to fund. This actually ensures that all of our districts have at least an equitable starting point in terms of keeping kids safe.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Next on the list, Leader Lamberth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for the work that you and your team do. And I want to highlight a couple of things that I think gets lost in the shuffle a little bit on this. Is there anybody in your team that can remember off the top of your head, and I've got the numbers if you don't have it, what the state allocation and appropriation was for this department, for the Department of Education and for our schools in Tennessee in 2010 and 11?
I do not.
Well, there probably somebody with about a couple minutes would be able to recall. I won't make you look it up. It was $3.6 billion, 3.6. And I bet you're pretty close on that. So think about this for a minute. $3.6 billion is what the state of Tennessee allocated for education, public education, K through 12 in this state in the year 2010-11 budget. This year's state allocation is $6.9 billion. I am sick and tired of hearing some people claim that we underfund education in this state. This legislature has stepped up. 2 governors in a row have stepped up. Multiple different colleagues of mine have made sacrifices and busted their tail to try to scrounge around money for the Department of Education, and it is now at $6.9 billion. I can go back to just 1920's numbers, okay? And if you recall, we were in the throes of a pandemic during that budget. We were at 5.2 billion in state allocations. Now we're at 6.9 billion. These are state dollars. That's a 32% increase. If you go back to 10 and 11, it's over 2.5 times increase in what the state is providing in K through 12 education. Now, I've heard some of my colleagues over the years say that, well, there's so much federal money coming into this. The federal allocation in 2010 and 11 was $1.9 billion. The federal allocation in 1920 was $1.1 billion. This will come as no shock to you that the federal allocation for this year is $1.8 billion. So while our friends in DC have kept their funding static for K through 12 education, even though everything else has gone up due to their poor decisions, our increase in K through 12 education has been phenomenal. And so thank you for using, all of your skills and talents to actually utilize that money for the benefit of our kids. But once and for all, surely to goodness, we can stop lying about the fact and claiming that somebody's underfunding education in this state, because it ain't happening. And that's Republicans and Democrats alike working hard to make sure to increase funding for students in this state. Thank you very much for the presentation today.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Leader Lambert. Next on my list, Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Leader Love. Leader Love told me I did a good job before I started. He may not feel that way after I get finished, though.
Do you have a question, sir?
I do, sir. Thank
Thank
you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Chair. I got a couple of questions. If the department was to request an amendment to ESSA, what's the timeline on that? How long would that take?
I'm laughing because it varies from 2 months to never hear back. So, and that's over years of experience. Traditionally, what happens is that if we request an amendment, the U.S. Department of Education is supposed to respond within 120 days to that. Oftentimes, there is a response, and then there is a great deal of back and forth, especially over the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years when we request any kind of amendment, clarification, et cetera. We do get a response within kind of that 2 to 3 month period. We usually have resolution within 8 to 9 months after the back and forth Zoom meetings, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. There was talk of refusal of federal dollars for education. How would that affect the department, and how would that affect education in Tennessee?
I think we would defer to the General Assembly in terms of that because that would require legislation. We would not be able to uniformly do that. We have provided some information in terms of the federal dollars we receive and then what those dollars are intended to be used for. In terms of what federal law says, we are still required to follow all federal and state laws. In terms of funding, I think that would be at the will of the General Assembly in terms of if those dollars were replaced or not. So the impact would vary depending on if the dollars were replaced.
Thank you, and I appreciate the nice attempt, but how would it affect education in Tennessee?
Can I clarify, are the dollars replaced or are they not replaced?
Not replaced.
So if they weren't replaced, then we would have just over $1 billion less than we do now.
Okay, thank you. The investment in the Achievement School District, what's been our total investment since the inception of the Achievement School District?
We could pull those numbers for you. In general, the Achievement School District is funded off of the basic education program money historically generated by the kids in that district. So overall, that's been about $100 million a year, give or take. Obviously, the size of the ASD has fluctuated over the course of the years since inception. So that number would have varied a little bit, but we're happy to pull that for you.
Thank you. So I think I can do the math from there, or, you know, you guys are in education, you might be able to do the math better for me. So $100 million per year for, and we're in, what's that? We're in year 14 or 15 of the ASD?
Oh, yeah.
So
we're
what's
about
that?
year 10.
100 million times, I'm sorry, what year, how many years?
10 years.
Yeah, we started in
Plus 10.
2011.
Yeah. Yes. So we had our first schools exit after a decade
Okay.
this last year.
So $100 million, let's say 10 years.
Mhm.
That puts us at $1 billion. Is that what the math says?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right, now y'all are the education experts here. Now look,
We're gonna add
you know,
some zeros. Yep.
so the state has basically invested $1 billion in the Achievement School District or more, you know, over since the inception of the Achievement School District. How many schools totally were under the purview of the Achievement School District, excluding iZone schools?
Yeah. I mean, it fluctuated quite a bit just in terms of some consolidation of schools that closed, et cetera. I think anywhere between 25 and 40 over the course of the 10 years.
And these schools all had the designation of priority schools, correct?
Correct.
Of those 40s, how many of those 40 schools came out of priority?
I think we'd have to pull that number. Generally speaking, across the state, our bottom 5% or lowest 7% performing schools very rarely come out of that priority status. That is traditional across the country.
Okay, thank you for that. This is on a different subject, and thank you for your answers
Of
for
course.
that.
Yes, sir.
I'll leave ASD alone now. Right. So on the ESSER 3
Mhm.
spending, what's the deadline for the spend down for the districts?
It is also September 30th. We do ask that they have all of their money accounted for in reimbursements by that June 30th, because that gives 3 months. If they have not spent their funding by June 30th, we need those 3 months to essentially either support them to spend down their funding, or it gives us the opportunity to reallocate those funds so they are spent down. Then we get to September 30th. That's kind of the deadline. From September 30th until December 31st, the state then has the opportunity to liquidate some of those funds with existing contracts, et cetera. So it's 2 3-month periods, one for districts to spend down, one for the state to spend down.
Okay, and one last question. Well, maybe two. The
No, last question.
one last question, like I
Yep.
said, the investment in the budget this year for the Achievement School District, how much money is it?
We'll look that up really quickly.
Okay.
It's listed at a total of $120 million.
So $120 million in the Achievement School District this year also.
Yes,
So
sir.
that'll put us over $1 billion, right? Well over $1 billion.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sparks, final question.
Thank you. Chairman, I know you've got a tough job. Bless your heart. I don't see how you and your staff do it. You know, it's like our fearless leader just mentioned, all the money that we spend. I think it's totally unsustainable. I don't think we can continue to do this like we've been doing for all these years. But this is a question for my school superintendent, chairman, Tammy Sharp, and Francis Rosales on the school board. Summer reading program funding, will that continue to be separate, or will that eventually be placed in the base funding for the TISA?
Summer programming will remain a separate source of funds, so it will not be part of our school funding formula.
Okay. Real quick, the Grow Your Own. I applaud y'all for doing that. What can we do to get more ex-military men involved in the classroom? I think it would help with the discipline problems. We got a guy that's doing that, Nick Corbett, that's at Rocky Fork, I think middle school. Loves it. He loves it. Loves the kids. But what can we do to try to recruit ex-military guys and ladies?
Gosh, so love that question. And I think one of the things, and we've been talking, I've personally been talking with Sarah Morrison, who's the executive director of the state board, around licensure. I think the barriers to entry into the profession, first and foremost, end up being financial, but second is just kind of unnecessary bureaucracy. We have to have high expectations for licensure, but there are easier pathways. We can remove some of those roadblocks, especially when we think about our service people across the country who might want to go into classrooms. So we are going to be working over the next 6 months to kind of formulate some proposals and ideas that will remove barriers and allow folks to enter the classroom faster while still maintaining that high preparation standard that we have. We do have some additional supports. I think Grow Your Own is a great opportunity and pathway for our military folks because they are able to maintain a salary. They're also able to be in the classroom immediately, and oftentimes our districts are allowing for some kind of alternative schedules so they can have additional work, et cetera.
Yes,
but
ma'am.
it's
Thank you.
great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner, and your team for coming today. We appreciate
Yes,
you
sir.
coming and presenting. And so without any questions, we're going to move on to the next presenter, which is the State Board Education. Dr. Morrison, I saw her there earlier. If you guys will go ahead and make your way up. I'm going to allow Colonel Whitson to make a short comment. So while we get the gavel back to the first string quarterback, who has now entered the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Acting Chairman Williams. Hey, I'd like to recognize my bride of 49 years that's joined us in the audience today, Pam, raise your hand, and my wonderful daughter-in-law, who is a fierce advocate for children with disabilities in our public schools, Emily. Thank y'all for being here. They're up here for Disability Day on the Hill.
Let me add my welcome to that, to my friend Pam and to Emily. We're delighted to have you here with us this morning. And just so you'll know, if you ever get invited to stay at Chairman Whitson's house, you should take him up on it because Pam fixes a mean breakfast. And I had a wonderful time there. So glad to have you here this morning. And Director, I'm sorry, I'm getting my head back together from the bill I just presented, but Director Morrison, thank you for joining us. We are excited to hear there's so much happening in education. We've just spent, a significant amount of time this morning with the commissioner. I know you were here for at least part of that, but there's nothing more important, I think, that we do in the state of Tennessee other than to oversee the education of our children. So we look forward to hearing your report on your budget and how your organization is supporting and just actively involved in that process. So without further ado, if you would introduce yourself and your teammates there, and then we'll look forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I couldn't agree more. Education is the most important thing we do as a society, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be here to report to you on the work of the State Board of Education. My name is Sarah Morrison. I'm the Executive Director at the Tennessee State Board of Education. I'll let my colleagues to my left and right make quick introductions.
Nathan James with the State Board.
Good morning, Michael Durline with the State Board.
Angie Sanders, General Counsel with the State Board.
We also have Bob Eby, our newly elected chair, with us in the audience, so we're happy to have him with us today as well. I'll go through just very briefly, and again, we'll really try to stick with the 5 minutes that was requested in terms of our overview. Talk briefly about the board's role, some key areas of our work, and then talk you through our specific budget questions. Like our partners in the General Assembly at the Tennessee State Board of Education, every decision we make, we make with students at the center. And so really thinking about the impact of policy and rule on our Tennessee students and their families across the state is what guides our work. You can see here where we fit in sort of the state governance. I like to say we fly at 30,000 feet. We take direction from lawmakers like yourself and the governor in terms of the rules and policies that we create with the intent of supporting instruction and learning at the classroom level. We work closely with our partners at the Department of Education around implementation, oversight, and support for that work. And this is a one-directional arrow, but it really is a feedback loop. We work very closely with our directors of schools and educators on the ground in classrooms, doing the hard work every day to inform the iterations of our policies and rules. You can see here a list of our current board. It's a fabulous board. If you haven't gotten to know your local members, these are our members that represent the congressional districts across the state. I mentioned Mr. Bob Eby, our now chair, who was our vice chair from the Oak Ridge area. We're delighted to have him with us. We also have one student member and an educator member, which also helps to ensure that we've got, present education perspective at every meeting that we have when we're thinking about teaching and learning. One quick note here too, you know this, I'm sure, but last legislative session, the appointment structure of our board changed, and now the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House have 3 members, as well as the Governor with 3 members. The Governor also appoints our student member, which is a high school student voting member. So the Governor has 4 members, but that is a recent change. So just noting there. A couple of slides, again, briefly on some of the key areas of the state board's work. I mentioned that we are the K-12 policy and rulemaking body for the state of Tennessee. So we spend most of our time thinking about policies and rules and regulations, but there are within that some specific areas of work that I want to mention today before we talk briefly about our very basic budget. That won't take much time at all. So standards review. This is always a topic of interest to the public and to your colleagues. How do we think about what students are needing to know and learn in each subject and grade? We currently have a 6-year cycle for reviewing standards in language arts, math, science, and social studies, our 4 core academic areas. It is extensive, it is comprehensive, it allows the public and anyone who has an interest in education to put their opinion online through 2 public surveys. That's part of our process. It starts with a public survey on the current standards in any given subject. We bring together some of our best educators from around the state, then both higher ed and K-12 educators, to look at that public feedback, to bring their expertise to bear and make revisions based on that initial feedback process to the standards. From there, we have another public review period, which I'll talk about in a minute. We're currently undergoing social studies standards review. After that second public survey, when the public again has had a chance to weigh in on every standard in the grade and subjects under review, we have what's called the Standards Recommendation Committee. That's a jointly appointed, again, the Lieutenant Governor, Speaker of the House, and the Governor body that comes together to look at that second review of the standards and make their formal recommendation to the State Board of Education about what students should need to know and do in any given subject or grade. So again, you can see this is an extensive process. It takes multiple years, and there are multiple touch points for the public to weigh in on this very important decision, because standards are at the core around our textbooks, our instructional decisions, our assessments. All of that is based on these instructional standards. So we take that responsibility very seriously. And as I mentioned, we're currently undergoing a review of the social studies standards. So the last week, the second public survey around social studies standards opened. I would encourage you to tell your colleagues and your educators back in your districts to be sure to weigh in on those standards. And then from that second survey, the Standards Recommendation Committee will begin their work. Some of those folks were appointed even or confirmed even yesterday in front of some of the House committees. That will take place over the course of this summer before those social studies standards come to the board in early 2024 for their recommendation and review. Another important responsibility that the board has is the educator preparation report card. This is something that is just a report. It's about transparency of program design and effectiveness of all of our preparation programs around the state who are tasked with the responsibility of educating our pre-service teachers. That report is based in statute and it's released annually in February. We just released our 7th report under the state board's oversight. And we've seen some improvements in priority metrics, which is exciting, both in the certification of teachers in high demand areas and also in teacher retention in Tennessee in those early years. That's something we're always tracking, and it's always a year delayed in terms of the data. So we will continue to update you on that report. Just to note that our accountability decisions around educator preparation are separate from this report. This is really about providing a user-friendly tool for students who are thinking about where to go to school, to learn to be a teacher, for districts who are thinking about hiring decisions. We do make decisions about accountability for educator preparation, but it's based on additional data and information that's beyond the scope of that report card, just a note. All right, quickly, just a couple more programmatic slides and then we'll talk budget. One of the newer responsibilities for the State Board of Education is as an evaluator of authorizers. So not an authorizer ourselves, but looking at charter schools across the state and the LEAs and the bodies that are making those decisions about which schools should open and which schools should close. We are now under TCA tasked with the responsibility of evaluating those authorizers, holding them to the state board's quality authorizing standards to ensure that they are making good decisions on behalf of the students and the communities in the areas across the state that have had applications for charter schools. We're only the 4th state to implement this kind of a process, and I think it will help to ensure over time that we're working closely with our districts and our other bodies like the ASD and the Charter Commission, who you'll hear from next, that they're making really great decisions on behalf of the communities and students around which schools should open and the support that they need to do good work on behalf of those families that they serve. Under TISA, we have some new responsibilities as well that I'll briefly go through. This past year, we've been busy along with our partners at the Department of Education, looking and making recommendations on the department's TISA rules. So we had some help analyzing those proposed rules. We did extensive hearings and gave feedback to the department before we made a recommendation ahead of their taking those rules to the Joint Government Operations Committee recently. We also have a new responsibility under that same statute that's going to put us in the place of holding hearings for districts and charter management organizations that have schools that receive a D or an F under the state's accountability model. That is still a couple years away. We received a new position last budget cycle for that work, and because we're still, in the preparation stage, we will not fill that position for another year. But we are working with our partners across the state extensively over the next few years to ensure that those hearings are a way to have a productive and positive conversation about how we can support students in those low-performing schools. Teacher licensure discipline. This is another one that takes a lot of time on behalf of the staff at the state board. Under Tennessee Code Annotated, we are charged with the authority to discipline licensed educators for misconduct. We currently have a team of 3 attorneys and 2 paralegals who handle that work. It is a lot, from intake of reports to gathering information from districts, law enforcement, Department of Child Services, litigating those cases when a hearing is requested. We've seen a steady increase in the number of misconduct reports, and we can talk about the reasons for that. There's a number of different reasons, but as you can see on the slide, in 2020, we went from 407 reports. The following year, in 2021, it was 536, and this latest year, we had 685. And so because of that, you'll see in our budget slides that is the one place where we've requested an improvement in the budget, which is a deputy general counsel position, $133,000 for that position, which will help oversee our team of attorneys and paralegals who are working on this very important aspect of the board's work. Just to give you a sense, we have 200 open cases at any time on average. Each attorney carries roughly 70 cases in addition to their other duties, and so we welcome the addition of that position in the executive budget. Really having a fully staffed legal team is going to ensure that we can protect student safety and uphold the high standards of the teaching profession. All right, on to the budget slides, and then we'll take whatever questions you may have. You'll see here again that one requested improvement in terms of the deputy general counsel would take us up to 17 full-time employees at the board. Here's our budget breakdown. It's all state dollars, relatively simple, 2.86 million in state dollars. And again, as requested, we would have, if approved, 17 full-time positions, all state funded. Finally, a few other topics that I know are of interest to this committee. We have not made any supplemental budget requests this year. Any reductions to our budget would be incorporated into the Department of Education's budget because we are administratively attached. And so we've identified $28,664 in third-party professional services if we are called to reduce our budget by 1%. We have no capital improvements, but I did mention we are pleased about the inclusion of the Deputy General Counsel in the governor's budget on the legal team. And we don't take federal funds, so there's nothing there to discuss. We do anticipate a modest reduction in funding with the passage of HB 258, which would move the standards review cycle from a 6-year cycle to an 8-year cycle. We can talk about that if it's an interest as well, but that would provide just over $26,000 in savings in our budget. And we never took COVID funding, so there's no loss of funding there to discuss. So with that, I will stop and turn it back to you, Madam Chair, for any questions.
Thank you, Director. We do have questions. I have just a couple of random ones before I call on my colleagues here. On the charter school authorizer evaluations, you mentioned we're only the 4th state to implement that. And in the evaluations that have been done to date, what kind of findings have there been?
I mean, for evaluations, I would say it's been a very positive process. Like the hearings that we're anticipating under TISA, we've had a long on-ramp to the charter authorizer evaluation work. So that's given our team a chance to work closely with the districts who have charter schools to prepare for this work. We had a pilot process that took 1.5 years. And so we've just concluded our first full cycle. It's a range. I mean, you'll hear from the Charter Commission in just a minute. They had an almost perfect rating under our evaluation cycle this last review period, which was encouraging, exciting to see, them setting the bar. We've also worked closely with our districts, though, who are, in a range of performance areas and in some cases working with them on corrective action plans. And you can note there, too, if there is a failure to make progress on those corrective action plans, there could be a reduction in unauthorizer fee dollars on the part of those authorizers. So there are some, kind of measures that we can put teeth into this work to say, we really do have high expectations for our authorizers. We're going to review you on a 2-year cycle, provide you the opportunity to improve practice where that's noted in the evaluation reports. And then again, if that doesn't improve, then there is the chance to reduce authorizer fee dollars there as well. So we can send you those actual reports if it's helpful in terms of the final
I think it would
ratings.
be interesting. And again, thanks for the information, because my follow-up question would have been, where's the stick? We sort of say the carrot, but
Mhm.
what kind of teeth are there? And if there is poor performance, I should say, in the review. And then on the teacher discipline issue, that's concerning increase. Can you talk to us a little bit about the type of complaints? Are they in particular areas? Are they widespread? And what your thoughts are on the reasons generating these additional numbers?
Absolutely. And I'll turn it over to our general counsel in just a moment. But just to take the first crack at answering your question, I think with the additional outreach that we've been able to do with our team, so looking not only at public schools, but at private schools, charter schools where we have licensed educators, really this work encompasses all licensed educators, even if they're not currently employed in a Tennessee public school. So as we do additional outreach, that's one of the reasons we see an increase in cases, is that we're reaching more audiences across the state who really need to be part of this process. Because if you have a state license in Tennessee, even if you're teaching in a private school, you have the ability to take that license over to a public school, and we need to know if there are issues of misconduct with that educator. The other thing is the laws that have changed coming through bodies like yours. So we now have the ability to take action against a superintendent's license if they have failure to report. We can't have a fence that, with missing pieces where, some districts are not reporting and then that educator is taking their license to another district and potentially causing harm to students. So there is responsibility that directors feel. I think increasingly they are taking this very seriously and sending reports to our office, not all of which end up in a misconduct action, but there is more reporting happening. And then there's also the ability to take action on an educator who has a permit, not a license, but a temporary permit. So I'll look to Angie Sanders, our general counsel, to talk about some of the specific types of misconduct if you're interested, but we can also follow up with more detail on that.
I think that helps us to understand. So thank you. And just in the interest of time, we'll move on. Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Director. Just to follow up on TISA funding last year, obviously the transfer in the fiscal note last year, it looked like there was a policy specialist in the budget. Just wondered if you've been able to hire that person. Doesn't look like you have yet, and whether the intent was to continue to pursue that or what the process was.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, on that matter, I met with Chairman Hazelwood. I also met with Senator Watson. The work on that, the first hearings will be in about 2025. So we went through the process. There were some major pieces of work that needed to be done. One was to give us some depth of knowledge so that we could hold the hearings and do the things we needed to on the Department of Education's rulemaking process. That happened so quickly into the beginning of the fiscal year, we could not fill the position in time to get that done. So instead, we contracted with the folks at TASER because nobody understands the interplay between government like that more than TASER does. So we contracted with them and did a very in-depth set of hearings on that. So the next round of work that goes with that position doesn't actually start for a while. So we talked about it in good conscience. We couldn't fill that position. Now, we absolutely need to keep it there, right? But you understand how the fiscal note process works. We can't put a fiscal note on a bill saying 4 years from now, I've got to have a position. The Constitution requires that be done on the year that the legislation is undertaken so that it can be funded in the following year. Now, I will tell you, we haven't reallocated that position. We haven't played with or used any of that equity that comes with that position. It is sitting there. It will be reverted, but the position has got to stay open so that it can be filled at the right point in time, which will be in the next year or 18 months, I would say.
All right. Thank you.
Chairman Hicks.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning. Good to see you all. Thank you all for being here. My question is regarding the report on key metrics of educator preparation providers to the state. And what I want to I guess ask is, are there any of those, based on that report, are there any of those providers that are not meeting expectations? And I'm curious to know how many, if there are some. And once those programs are identified, what's done to help them get back on track? And we'll start there first.
I'm going to defer to my colleague, Michael Derline, who is an expert in this area.
Thank you for the question. Michael Derline, Deputy Executive Director at the State Board. Each year, we do have a number of EPPs that don't meet expectations. We have changed our category ratings a little bit over the years. In 2019, we had 2 that fell below expectations. Prior to that, we had 4, 2, and then 5, respectively, each year looking back. One thing I'd say is that, as Dr. Morrison mentioned, the Department of Education is actually responsible for the review and recommendation of approval for EPPs. But these 2 activities are related. So all of the metrics that we report on our teacher preparation report card are also part of the department's annual reports and built into their comprehensive review process. So as they're making decisions about recommendations for approval, those factors are considered then.
Okay. And then just as a follow-up, so can you provide, I guess, some details on the state's current placement and retention rates?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but we can get that for you.
Follow up. And the
Yeah.
report card really tracks the first 3 years of employment for educators, so we can send you that data.
Okay, great. Thank you. If you could just send it to the Chair Lady's office and she can send that out. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Chairman Zachary.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Director. Good to see you this morning. In 2021, we enacted legislation that required the board to establish a training program with LEAs for the purpose of recommending eligible educators for endorsement. You guys were required to set rules for that. Could you tell us if those rules have been promulgated and if that process has been established? And if so, just provide us an overall update, please.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll defer to our general counsel. We have promulgated rules. She can give you a little bit more detail.
Sure. Angie Sanders, General Counsel for the board. I believe you're speaking about the law around LEAs being able to train teachers. Yes, those rules have been promulgated and are currently in effect.
Thank you. Well, can you give us an update just on the process and if any if LAAs have provided endorsements, and just give us an overall update on the
In terms of which programs and how many
Yes, ma'am.
are in that, it's still a handful. We may have to follow up. I know Rutherford County was one of the first to win approval. And so they are actually able to train teachers, not only for endorsement, but for their licensure as well. So if it's okay, we'll follow up and send you that information.
That'd be great. Yep.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I believe Representative Barrett, you had a request for a personal announcement.
Yes, Madam Chair. I'd just like to welcome some gentlemen that walked into the room in uniform here, particularly those from the city of Dixon. Gentlemen, we've got a fantastic fire department. Our chief's here. Want to welcome the firemen that have joined us this morning.
This committee is glad to have you present, gentlemen. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. But for the sake of time and sacrifice, I'm going to forego my questions and comments.
Representative Love.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to recover here for a few seconds. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that you're in the process of reviewing social studies standards right now. What can members of the General Assembly do to help make the public aware of those opportunities? I know oftentimes when we have chances for public comment, sometimes people just don't get to see it, even though it's out there and it's advertised. What can we do to help with that process?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I really appreciate that because that really is key to the process, is getting as many people involved and weighing in. So we'd be happy to send the link to that survey to this body so that you can share that with your constituents, with your family members, with really, we want feedback from all corners and all walks of life. So the more we can share that link and have people go online and take that survey during the 4 weeks that it's open, the better. Yeah, we've had, and I should mention, in the first public survey, we had 114,000 comments, which is a record for any reviews that we've done in the past decade. So there's a lot of interest, obviously, in this area.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I'm going to have to ask to be excused. This is the Fraternity and Sororities Day on the Hill, and I had to go take a picture with the governor and Sam McKenzie.
I'm really disappointed that you're not taking a picture with us, but we understand. But hopefully that will be a quick turnaround, Representative Love, and we'll expect you back. Leader Camper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative was just talking about the social study standards, and someone emailed me some concerns about moving the social study requirements from 5th grade to 3rd grade, and that this was going to be very monumental in terms of the questions that we were asking 3rd graders to know about that really should be asked in the later years when they're able to think more critically. So can you talk about that? You know, why we are pushing questions. Some of these questions are amazing that we're going to be asking 3rd graders to know and understand. And it's before they even learn some U.S. history. We're asking these questions that they're very difficult questions.
No, thank you for that question. And the first thing I would note is that this is an iterative process. So it's not done. As I mentioned to Representative Love, the survey is open currently, and the Standards Recommendation Committee is going to be coming together to look at the early work of our educator teams before bringing that before the board. So a lot could still change. One of the things that I would say challenging about the social studies standards process is that there are a number of laws, and you all are familiar, that govern aspects of what needs to be in social studies standards. One of them is having a kind of a standalone Tennessee history course. And so that had currently been in the 5th grade. My colleague, Michael Derline, can talk a little bit more about this, but the educators had a lot of reasons when they looked at moving that to 3rd grade that we can go into in more detail, probably in a phone conversation outside of committee, but I can send you an email as well. However, again, I think it's an open question whether that's where it will stay or whether it will shift again as part of this iterative process with the feedback that we're collecting currently. So I don't know, Michael, do you want to add into that? Because there are a number of details there that would be relevant to share with you.
Yeah, I would just say, I think I know the individual you're referencing, and we've received that email as well. I think generally speaking too, I think that educator advisory team really was interested in grounding the context of history in the most local space that students could understand best, Tennessee. That said, as Dr. Morrison mentioned, this is an iterative process, so there are still a number of conversations to be had about that decision and whether that's appropriate. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Madam Chair. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I agree that learning Tennessee history is a great thing. I think that's perfect. That's great. But the problem I'm having is moving from a 5th grade level of understanding to a 3rd grade level of understanding and comprehension when we are already dealing with 3rd grade retention because of whatever reason we think it is. This is just more stuff to be putting on 3rd graders. And if you read some of these questions, it's amazing. It's too much. You know, I can read some of them. I won't. It's just some of these questions it's too much for a 3rd grader. So we could talk offline. I can email you these questions that I got. I just didn't understand why we're asking 3rd graders to know about, explaining the Constitution and explaining stuff that they don't even know what a Constitution is at the 3rd grade. They just learn, it's just too much. And in my mind, I don't even understand why this group even thought this was something that should have even been considered for people to even be giving feedback on this level of comprehension for a 3rd grader. They're stressed out enough. I don't understand
Well, thank you. Again, we've heard similar concerns, and just to reiterate, the final decision will be the Standards Recommendation Committee. So it's not a done deal. We've had similar conversations, having looked at some of those same emails probably and the questions being raised. And so I think, again, we can have a more detailed conversation and talk about the educators' reasons and also what are the lingering concerns that this public survey right now is designed to pick up. The Standards Recommendation Committee will absolutely be grappling with. This will probably be the key issue that they're looking at, because we have heard similar concerns and questions, and everything's a trade-off. There are no sort of perfect scenarios necessarily when you're looking at where to fit some of these things in, but I very much take these concerns seriously, and we are looking at that as well.
Which is why I think it's important that Representative Love mentioned that we get the links to people to, chime in on this. It's a lot of people don't even know this conversation is going on. And then the next thing you know, you got parents dealing with
That's right.
how to facilitate this and how to help their students. So the fact that we even having a conversation is I have a problem with, I mean,
we gotta get
just
that
skip
link out.
right past the 4th grade and went straight to the 3rd grade. Well, we already have problems. It's just, it's a problem. So we'll talk about it offline.
Well, Representative Camper, we would make the point that the Standards Recommendation Committee it's composed of 10 folks who are appointed, 4 by the governor, 3 by each, and under the law, it's kind of their decision, and they haven't even met once. So please don't think it's a done deal by any means.
Camper, if we could wrap this up, we are way behind.
I understand the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Director, and your team. We appreciate you being here with us this morning and waiting a bit past your scheduled time. We are going to ask that our Charter School Commission folks who also have waited a bit or past their scheduled time to come forward as welcome, Director Stovall, and we're happy to see you. We are members, we have our scheduled 10 o'clock departure date, but the room is empty for a bit longer. So while this is really important information, and we're going to try to give it the attention and the time that it deserves, but I would ask that questions be pointed and brief when we get to that point. Director, I'm sorry. Please Representative Parkinson, you've. Oh. Okay. All right. Thank you. Director Stovall, please introduce your colleagues there, and special shout out to my friend and fellow Hamilton Countyan, Tom Griscom, who has been doing yeoman's work in this area for quite a long time. So thank you all for the work that you do. But Tom, thank you especially since you're my guy.
I think Tess passed the ball to me. Is that on?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Tom Griscom. I am the chair of the Public Charter School Commission, and I serve as your chair indicated from Chattanooga, Tennessee. With me today is our executive director, Tess Stovall, our director of external affairs, Hayden Pendergrass, and our director of finance and operations, Melanie Harrell. When the General Assembly created us in 2019, we were charged with authorizing high-quality public charter schools as another public school option for children in Tennessee. I believe our record to date shows that we are committed to achieving that goal. Since we were last before this committee, we've heard 16 new school start appeals. 5 were approved. LEA's decisions were upheld 7 times, and 4 were withdrawn. The 5 the commission approved met the high bar set by the state for quality applications, and these schools should serve as quality educational options for students in the years ahead. We take seriously the responsibilities that Governor Lee and you, the General Assembly, placed upon us when we were established. As an example, we just completed our first authorizer review cycle with the State Board of Education. We received a 3.9 out of 4 rating, the highest of any charter authorizer in the state. And again, I think that highlights our commitment to meet national best practices and quality standards for all of our schools. We appreciate the opportunity to be before you today, and I'm now going to turn to our Executive Director, Tess Stovall, to provide more details. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Griscom, Chair Lady, committee members. Thank you for having us here today. I'd like to take a few moments to walk through our FY24 budget request. So we have 2 cost increases that we are bringing forth, but neither of them are asking for additional state funding. The first is 3 new positions to support the growing work of the Charter Commission. So we at the Charter Commission are the school district for any authorized school that operates under our portfolio. And so what that means is that we are responsible for all of the district functions that a traditional school district has to oversee. So 2 of these positions would be to continue to support our increasing functions as a district. And then the third position would be to support our increasing functions as an appellate body. So the school district under the commission currently has 9 authorized charter schools. And when we're looking into school year 23-24, that will increase to 14. So our portfolio continues to grow, which means that the work of our district functions continue to grow. 2 of those positions would support specifically our TISA implementation, support of our student data, and our federal programs and special populations oversight. Additionally, as the chair said, we are responsible for serving as the appellate body for charter school decisions in Tennessee. As he stated, in the last 2 years, we've received 16 new start appeals. In this current application cycle, 21 charter school applications have been submitted across the state. So therefore, we intend and expect that the commission's workload will continue to increase around charter school appeals. And so one additional position would be to support that continued growth of that work. And the second cost increase is simply to recognize the increase in That's me. Is to support the increase in funding that our schools will get under our school district. Because, as I said, we are a school district. All funds around federal grants and TISA funding flow from the department to us. So as we add new schools or our schools grow grades, we therefore have to receive additional TISA funding. And finally, I did want to make a note about the continued charge of the General Assembly for us to move to self-sustainability on the authorizer fee. We understand this charge. This is something we take very seriously. And as our work continues to grow, we are continuing to increase the amount of authorizer fee revenue that we collect and that oversee our operating costs. So in FY22, approximately 30% of our operating costs were covered by our authorizer fee. In this current fiscal year, we're expecting to be somewhere around 2/3 of our operating costs covered by our authorizer fee. And so as we continue to expand schools within our portfolio, as well as open new schools, we're continuing to move towards that goal. Until our fee completely covers all of our operating costs, we do have state revenue that supports our operations. We continue to use that judiciously and trying to revert as much as possible back to the general fund. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak for you all today, and we are happy to take questions.
Thank you. And I know that it's been an incredibly busy season, and we have a volunteer board who does this work. So I think the state of Tennessee, and particularly this General Assembly, owes a big thank you to those folks who devote a lot of time and energy and travel across the state to make sure that when we have these charter appeals, particularly, that they are, they're vetted properly and a good determination is made for the best outcome for Tennessee students. We do have questioners. Chairman Crawford, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Once the TISA program is fully implemented, does the commission expect to receive any increase in your interdepartmental funding?
Yes, absolutely. So we do anticipate receiving an increase in our interdepartmental funding because we are growing the number of students that we're serving in our district. Currently, we serve about 3,500 students. With next year, with our growth in terms of our portfolio of schools, we're estimating to be about 6,000 students. So we do anticipate that our TISA revenue in terms of interdepartmental will increase. And with that, the amount of authorizer fee revenue that we collect will also increase.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Chairman Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question surrounds the Charter School Facilities Fund. I understand that a total of 34 million recurring and 40 million non-recurring has been appropriated to that Charter School Facilities Fund. Can you provide details on how this fund is utilized, please?
Thank you for that question. That fund is actually administered by the Department of Education, so we don't have any oversight over those grant funds. Our schools within our portfolio are able to apply directly for those funds. I'd be more than happy to make sure that the department follows up with you about that question.
Thank you. And I think this may be more within your purview regarding this. If the number of authorized charter schools were to continue to increase, would we need to look at this fund more closely in terms of possibly growing it?
So I think that as we think about the number of schools authorized statewide, since that is a statewide pool, not just exclusively to the Charter Commission, one of the big pieces that we have to look at is facilities fundings for charter schools. That is the biggest cost for our charter schools, and something that that we are seeing when we are opening and approving charter schools is one of the biggest challenges that they're facing. So certainly, I think additional funding and revenue support our charter schools, particularly our high quality charter schools that are supporting students around facilities is absolutely a priority, and something that we talk a lot about internally about how do we support schools in the facility front.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Just a question of charter schools. You mentioned the increasing number of applications for the next year. Can you give us a sort of idea of where those, are they concentrated in the urban areas? Are any of these charters being developed outside, the core, the Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville kind of areas that we've seen them to date?
Thank you for that question. I'd be happy to follow up with the official list of applications that are being considered. But there are applications that are in Nashville and Memphis, Chattanooga and Knoxville, but we are seeing a significant number that are outside of those core areas. Rutherford County, Murray County, Robertson County, Clarksville, Montgomery, and Jackson Madison all are reviewing and receiving charter applications right now. And those districts currently do not have any charter schools within their portfolios. Except Rutherford, their schools have been approved, but they have not opened yet.
And a follow-up question to that, from approval date to opening date, what does that time lag look like?
That's a great question. So when typically an applicant is applying approximately 18 months in advance. So when we are receiving an appeal and deciding typically in October, they're being approved to open that next following school year. There is the option in state law for a charter school to opt for a 1-year delay. And typically why we're seeing that 1-year delay is from a facility standpoint, identifying a facility, signing a lease, constructing a facility, that takes time and money and energy. So, anywhere between 12 months to 18 months I think is a typical on-ramp for a charter school to start successfully and have all the pieces in place to open successfully.
And I should know this, but I don't, so I'll ask you, have we had charter schools that were authorized by your commission? Are all of those still in operation?
Yes.
So we haven't had any closed that were vetted through your
At
process?
this point, that's we have 9 currently in operation. All of those are still opening. We have not approved anything that's under our jurisdiction that is closed.
Thank you. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. How many students are you projected to have in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years, I would have to get back to you. I know for sure for next school year, we're looking to be about 6,000. But we are happy to follow up with you with the current approved track record and what we might be year over year.
Okay, and I don't need an exact number, but so what is that? What's your percentage of growth each year? Because I'm just trying to get a ballpark figure for the next 5 years.
So this year, we're at 9 schools. We're moving to 14 schools. So 2 of those schools are coming from the Achievement School District and are moving under us. And then we have 3 new schools that have been approved. And we also have 2 additional schools that will open in the following school year. So at that point, that's what we know our trajectory is. But every year we hear appeals that number could increase.
Okay, thank you for that. So you are the state's second school district, correct?
That's correct.
So we have 2 state-run school districts in the state.
That's correct.
Okay. How many appeals have you had from the, how many appeals have you had totally?
So in total, we've had 16 New Start appeals since the commission was started in 2019.
Okay, and how many of those appeals were from the Big 4 districts?
I have my chart.
You're awesome.
7.
So out of the 16, nearly half of them were from the Big 4.
That is correct.
And how many of those out of those 7 were approved?
4.
4, okay. And now, so that means that 9 of them came from outside of the Big 4 districts, right? How many of those 9 were approved?
1.
1. So what's the difference? What's the difference in the reasoning for almost only 10% of those being approved from outside of the Big 4, where you have almost 50% being approved from those inside of the Big 4?
Sure. So I think it's most helpful if I talk specifically by application, because ultimately it's about the quality of the application and the community demand and need, as opposed to looking from where are the schools specifically coming from an application perspective. So 2 of the 4 that we approved in Metro Nashville are KIPP Nashville schools. We operate 2 of those currently in our portfolio. One of those 2 schools has been named a reward school. The elementary school is currently exceeding the district average in terms of reading proficiency. So when that applicant came and wanted to expand their portfolio in the Antioch area, we saw that this is a high performing charter school. We saw it has an exceedingly high wait list. And we thought this is an opportunity to continue to serve the students in the Aranac area. The other application that we just recently approved is for a nature academy in the southeast Antioch area of Nashville. And that's an option that's not currently available in Nashville. It's a unique opportunity for students, and it has very significant community support and demand. So really, when we're evaluating charter schools, it's about the quality of the application and the community need, and whether or not they're filling a community need, as opposed to looking at, specifically, oh, this came from this specific district or not. Again, I think the majority of applications that have been submitted, or probably 50-50 this year, are from non-authorizing districts. So I look forward to coming back in front of this committee next year, and we can talk about if we've approved any others and the why. But ultimately, we're looking at the quality of the application.
And I appreciate that,
Yeah.
but what I'm seeing in the numbers is that 90% of the applications outside of the Big Four were not worthy of approval. And that's striking to me. 90% of the applications outside of the Big Four are not worthy of appeal. But almost 50% of the applications inside of the Big Four are worthy of appeal, and that's striking to me. I'm trying to get my hands around that.
Representative
Understand why.
Parkinson,
Yes, ma'am.
I might interject.
Absolutely.
One of the key points I think that the director made, community support is a huge issue, a huge part of what they consider. And when you get outside the Big Four, I think sometimes that community support is more difficult, maybe not so much in terms of interest, but in terms of financial capabilities and those sorts of things. So I think you have to account for all of those differences when you're looking at those numbers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me ask this real quick. So the KIPP schools that you mentioned, one is a reward school, and thank God for that. Well, the other school, what's the letter grade for the other school that's not a reward school?
So the department didn't issue letter grades. That school is an elementary school, and that's the school I was speaking to, that its proficiency rates are higher than Metro Nashville Public Schools. This next school year, because it's just tested third grade this year, it's testing third and fourth grade. And when letter grades are issued by the department, they will receive a letter grade.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And thank you, Director. Thank you, Chairman Griscom, and the rest of the team. Again, I think charter schools we have issues with education in the state of Tennessee. I think that's clear. There are many ways to attack that problem, and I certainly think that charter schools have a role in that. And I appreciate, and I know this committee does, the work that you do to make sure that the charter schools that we do put in place are going to actually do what we expect them to do and give children an opportunity to learn. I have a charter school in my district that's an outdoor school. It's just a whole different curriculum than anything that the public school can offer. And I am sorry, Representative Sparks, I'm doing my wind down, and I just realized that you had a question.
Real quick, we just had a charter that was approved on appeal, had community support. They're having a tough time finding land. They finally closed on some property. You know, my community, as our former mayor can echo, Mayor Ketron, we just can't continue to build schools. The next projected high school is 125 million. Like I just mentioned to Commissioner Penny Schwinn, it's totally unsustainable. The growth that we're doing, there's more taxes, more fees, more impact fees. The average home in my community is $390,000. Our own kids can't even afford to live in their own community. It's something that's shocking. Phil Williams is not going to tell that story. So I think what y'all are doing is commendable, and I appreciate it. And I could go on, but I'm not, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you all for being here. Chairman Griscom, thank you particularly for coming from Chattanooga to join us this morning. And with that, members, we are back in session. And let the record show that at 10:09 on this date, we have completed budget hearings for the 23-24 budget. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. We are adjourned.